Okay, cool. So I am trying out streaming my reading and researching process as a kind of self-commitment, pre-commitment device tool. Uh, this will be super boring and of no value to anyone. So yeah, I definitely don't recommend watching this. This is more just a way for me to commit myself to doing this rather than just like lying in bed all day or playing games. But anyway, what I'm planning to do is we're going to be reading the cause reports from Open Philanthropy Project. I just read that one, so we'll be starting with alcohol taxation. And yeah, we're just going to go down the list. I'll probably get bored and switch to something else at some point. Yeah. Also, I use this reading text-to-speech thing, which helps me concentrate a lot more. Oh, that didn't come through.
Email. This is a write-up of a shallow investigation, a brief look at an area that we use to decide how to prioritize further research. In a nutshell, what is the problem? The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that excessive drinking causes tens of thousands of deaths and costs society hundreds of billions of dollars every year in the United States. What are possible interventions? We focus on alcohol excise taxes in this investigation. The evidence suggests that alcohol consumption is sensitive to price changes, and so alcohol excise taxes are likely to decrease consumption and related social costs. In general, the value of taxes on alcohol has eroded in the past few decades. However, some statewide campaigns to raise alcohol taxes have been successful in recent years. A funder could support a variety of research or advocacy efforts at the state or federal level to encourage alcohol tax increases. Who else is working on it? A number of organizations support work related to alcohol abuse prevention and treatment, but our understanding is that few focus on alcohol tax policy, and we are not aware of any major active funders in the area. Some research is being conducted by the U.S. government and other institutions. Published, March 2016. Table of contents. What is the problem? What are possible interventions? Alcohol taxation. What has the track record of past advocacy efforts been? Who else is working on this? Questions for further investigation. Our process. Sources. Back to top. What is the problem? Excessive drinking has been linked to significant costs to society, including increased liver disease, reckless driving, lost productivity, unsafe sex and stees, and violent crime. Although the exact social cost is uncertain, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, reports that alcohol causes around 88,000 deaths, 10% of all deaths among working age adults, and costs the economy around $224 billion per year in the U.S. too. Binge drinking, defined as having 4 or more drinks in one session for women. And
What? Did you hear that? Alcohol causes around 88,000 deaths, 10% of all deaths among working age adults. My God. What? I'm just going to lower my table and say that is crazy. With stats like that, you can see why the US prohibition was a thing, right?
Further, excessive drinking cost the U.S. economy $224 billion in 2006, or $1.90 a drink. These costs were largely due to lost productivity, healthcare expenses, and criminal justice costs. As a result, about $2 and $5 of these costs were paid by government. Our non-verbatim summary of a conversation with the CDC's alcohol program, September 5, 2014. Heavy drinking is associated with many health and social problems, including liver disease, unsafe sex, domestic violence, homicide, and reckless driving. Rudman 2015, PG1. Excessive drinking is responsible for 88,000 deaths in the U.S. each year, including 1 in 10 deaths among working-age adults. These deaths result in over 2.5 million years of potential life lost, YPLLs, shortening the lives of those who've died by an average of 30 years. Further, excessive drinking cost the U.S. economy $224 billion in 2006, or $1.90 a drink. These costs were largely due to lost productivity, healthcare expenses, and criminal justice costs. As a result, about $2 and $5 of these costs were paid by government. Our non-verbatim summary of a conversation with the CDC's alcohol program, September 5, 2014.
That is crazy. Also, yeah, I haven't heard this. Years of potential life lost. So maybe that, so there's QALYs, which is quality adjusted life years lost, or I mean, sorry, not lost. So maybe that doesn't account for disability and just accounts for, and quality of life, and just accounts for years. Okay, sorry. Back to, yeah, that is crazy. 10% of all deaths among working age adults.
We began investigating alcohol tax policy after hearing from Mark Kleiman and Foucault that they found the research on the impact of alcohol taxes promising. 5 in particular, Kleiman claimed that increasing alcohol taxes is likely one of the most effective ways to reduce crime. 6. We have focused primarily on alcohol tax policy, which we see as having several advantages as an approach to reducing excessive drinking. We start with an assumption that raising prices will reduce consumption. The taxes would be relatively easy to implement and enforce, and governments are incentivized to enforce the law in order to collect revenue. 7. There has been extensive research on the effects of alcohol excise taxes on harms from alcohol, which we discuss below. We are aware of other potential interventions, but have not investigated them. These include supporting the implementation of social host ordinances. These ordinances render adults criminally and/or financially liable for underage drinking on their property. 8. Further restricting when and where individuals are able to purchase alcohol. 9. Imposing marketing restrictions on alcohol companies, especially for marketing aimed at young people. 10. Increasing the price of alcohol by restricting happy hours and other discounts. 11. Swift and certain sanctions, mild but almost immediate punishment for alcohol abuse, for people on probation for alcohol-related crimes. 12. Stricter enforcement of current laws and regulations, such as the minimum drinking age, and driving under the influence laws. 13. Supporting litigation campaigns against alcohol companies. 14. Back to top. Alcohol taxation. The tax rate of alcohol in inflation-adjusted terms has decayed significantly in recent years. 15. Federal alcohol taxes have not been raised since 1991, and many states have kept alcohol taxes level for decades. 16. The experts we spoke with suggested that increasing alcohol taxes can reduce consumption and bring alcohol's private costs more in line with its social costs. 17. Heavy drinkers would bear most of the cost of the tax and contribute most to raising revenue. 18. The Open Philanthropy Project commissioned David Rudman to conduct a replication review of the existing literature to assess the evidence about the likely humanitarian impacts of raising alcohol taxes. He summarizes the large existing literature and estimates that a 10% increase in the price of alcohol would lead to roughly a 5% reduction in the amount of alcohol consumed. 19. The best evidence also seems to indicate that higher alcohol prices cause a substantial decrease in alcohol-caused death, particularly at a cirrhosis. 20. We have less information about possible tax-induced reductions in violence and traffic deaths. 21. Overall, Rudman's review estimates that a 10% tax-induced price hike in the U.S. would reduce the number of alcohol-caused deaths by 9.25%, which would amount to 2,000,000 fewer deaths per year. 22. Using the more expansive CDC definition of alcohol-caused deaths and assuming that alcohol tax increases would have the same proportional effect on them, a 10% price increase would lead to 8,000,022,000 fewer deaths per year in the U.S. 23. However, our impression is that a 10% increase in prices is significantly larger than recent state alcohol tax increases, which have raised prices by more like 3%. Back to top. What has the track record of past advocacy?
Okay, so replication. David Rudman, who is the heavyweight of looking through empirical studies. Okay, so thinks that a 10% increase in the price of alcohol
Overall, in my view, the preponderance of the evidence says that higher prices do correlate with less drinking and lower incidence of problems such as cirrhosis deaths. And, as I elaborate, I see little reason to doubt the obvious explanation. Higher prices cause less drinking. A rough rule of thumb is that each 1% increase in alcohol price reduces drinking by 0.5%. Nelson 2013, as discussed below. And, extrapolating from some of the most powerful studies, I estimate an even larger impact on the death rate from alcohol-caused diseases, 1-3% within months. By extension, a 10% price increase would cut the death rate 9-25%. For the US in 2010, authors' calculations, based on WHO, this represents 2,000 to 6,000 averted deaths year, PG2. Most studies find the expected negative correlation between alcohol prices and total drinking. Even Nelson, 2013, 2014, in his skepticism, agrees. I like his publication bias-adjusted elasticity estimates, -0.29 for beer, -0.46 for wine, -0.54 for spirits, -0.494. Total alcohol PG49. 0. Overall, in my view, the preponderance of the evidence says that higher prices do correlate with less drinking and lower incidence of problems such as cirrhosis deaths. And, as I elaborate, I see little reason to doubt the obvious explanation. Higher prices cause less drinking. A rough rule of thumb is that each 1% increase in alcohol price reduces drinking by 0.5%. Nelson 2013, as discussed below. And, extrapolating from some of the most powerful studies, I estimate an even larger impact on the death rate from alcohol-caused diseases, 1-3% within months. By extension, a 10% price increase.
The number of alcohol-caused deaths.
What has the track record of past advocacy efforts been? David Jernigan reports that reform advocates attempt to increase alcohol taxes in 30 states per year, of which the vast majority fail, 25. At least 2 states, Illinois and Maryland, have recently raised alcohol taxes, and the Maryland increase included a public health, not just a revenue-raising rationale. It combined a public health message with a coalition of 200 groups and won a sales tax increase of 3%, or roughly 5 cents per drink, which amounted to a $75 million annual increase in state revenues. 26. We do not know how feasible it would be to replicate the Maryland tax increase in other states. A consideration in favor of state, rather than federal campaigns is the possibility that the success of several campaigns could create enough momentum to prompt changes in other states or at the federal level. A similar process occurred after several states first altered their tobacco tax policies in response to an increased understanding of the dangers of smoking. 27.
Okay, so it looks like past advocacy for whole taxation has been not very full. Just because I'm from Australia and I always Okay.
Our understanding is that alcohol policy research and advocacy has experienced a decline in private funding, and there is little support for alcohol policy reform from large foundations today. 28. A number of organizations, such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving, work on alcohol policy. 29. These organizations represent a strong alcohol abuse prevention and treatment community. However, our impression is that most concentrate their efforts on scientific research, alcohol addiction, abuse treatment, and decreasing drunk driving, rather than optimal alcohol tax policy. 30. We are aware of only a couple small exceptions. The Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth, CUMI, offers research and advocacy training relating to alcohol tax policy increases. 31. The CDC funds a few $1 million worth of research and advocacy on alcohol policy each year, including supporting CAMI's work on alcohol tax policy. 32. Back to top.
2000, a 10% tax increase. How much alcohol is bought each year? Sale of over 2.252 billion in 2019. So if you increase the tax by 10%, you could save 2,000 to 6,000 lives per year and generate $2.25 billion in revenue, which sounds pretty good. How many is that divided by? $78 per person. Not quite the Yang universal basic income.
Our investigation in this area has been limited, and many important questions remain unanswered by our investigation. Amongst other topics, our further research on this cause area might address: how would additional funding translate into additional advocacy efforts, and to what extent is funding the bottleneck to advocacy success on alcohol tax issues? How should we think about the momentum dynamics at the state and federal level? 33. What are the possible negative social and economic consequences of alcohol tax increases? What other interventions might cost effectively reduce the harms from alcohol? Do people displace alcohol consumption with the consumption of other drugs when alcohol taxes rise?
Cool, yeah, so I think my key update is that the relative deaths of alcohol are way higher than I thought, maybe comparable to smoking. Yeah, 1 in 10 working age adults.
We initially decided to investigate this issue because Mark Kleiman, one of our criminal justice reform grantees, told us that excessive alcohol consumption was the most important public policy issue he knew of, with no major advocate. 34. While Kleiman was primarily focused on the impact of alcohol on crime, the bulk of our research has been on the public health aspects of alcohol consumption. We've spoken to roughly half a dozen individuals in our exploration.
Okay, so let's increase alcohol taxation. Okay, anthropogenic climate change.
In a nutshell, what is the problem? Unmitigated anthropogenic, i.e. human-caused climate change is likely to have extremely negative effects across a wide variety of outcomes, including hunger, flooding, destruction caused by extreme weather, human health, and the economy, over the next century. What are possible interventions? Philanthropists could pursue many different avenues to try to prevent or adapt to climate change. We are not confident in our assessment of the likely returns to any of them. Who else is working on it? Some major foundations, such as the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, are heavily involved in efforts to limit climate change. Overall, American philanthropic funding for climate change activities appears to be on the order of several $100 million per year, while U.S. federal government funding for climate change activities is around $8 billion per year, mostly $6 billion a year, on developing technology to reduce emissions. Published May 2013, updated November 2013. Table of contents. What is the problem? What are possible interventions? Who else is working on this?
That overall American philanthropic funding for climate change activities appear to be on the order of several $100 million per year. Yeah, I think I would have expected more than that. Yeah, no, I think I would have expected more than that. So, like one number that's popping into my head is that GiveWell, I think, in the next few years wants to move $1 billion a year. So yeah, and I definitely, if you'd ask me, like, will total donations moved through GiveWell be more than total US philanthropic funding for climate change? Maybe it's just they're talking about just like big foundations, and that doesn't account for like small donors. Yeah, well, I guess we'll see.
This questions for further
also, this was in 2013, so that's fair enough. That's like, yeah, I would guess that's gone up.
Investigation. Sources. Back to top. What is the problem? To assess the magnitude of climate change impacts, we have dealt separately with the most likely impacts and unlikely but potentially extremely harmful impacts, because they present different issues and may call for different approaches. In attempting to assess the most likely impacts of unmitigated climate change, we focused on reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. The IPCC, along with Al Gore, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for its work on synthesizing the research on climate change. We believe it to represent the most authoritative consensus view of current science regarding climate change. We summarize our reading of the IPCC's 2007 Fourth Assessment Report on this page. Briefly, we find that unmitigated climate change would have extraordinarily negative humanitarian impacts across all of the outcomes we looked at: hunger, water stress, flooding, extreme weather, health, biodiversity, and the economy. Successfully mitigating these negative impacts would carry vast humanitarian benefits. When looking at the range of possible futures outlined in the report, the bulk of the variation, in humanitarian terms, comes from variation in the level of assumed economic growth and adaptation, rather than variation in the amount of climate change. Of the outcomes we examined, only biodiversity is expected to be unambiguously worse off in the future as a result of both climate change and economic growth. More here, because of some of the dynamics of climate change. Extreme but unlikely climate changes contribute disproportionately to the total expected harm of climate change. We summarize our understanding of these dynamics and give some examples of how extreme climate changes could be particularly catastrophic on this page. Many of these potentially extreme outcomes are not well captured by the models described in our main page on climate impacts, which is based primarily on the IPCC's Fourth Assessment Report, suggesting that page likely underestimates the total expected damages from climate change. Our page on extreme risks also discusses some of the approaches to dealing with extreme climate change that may be different from the overall approaches to climate change discussed on the rest of this page. More here. Back to top. What are possible interventions? Philanthropic funding could be used for many different activities aiming to...
So they're dividing the problem of climate change into the mainline, most likely scenarios, which are like bad, and then the like 1% or more extreme scenarios, which could be like really, really bad. So I would say that like the most likely impacts are, the like between 2 or 3 degrees, kind of that, like, the standard stuff you hear people talk about. And then this unlikely thing is like, okay, but what if those 2 or 3 degrees cause a runaway effect and we get like 10 or 15 degrees of warming this century, which is unlikely, and but just in the same way that like the chance of nuclear war is unlikely, but if it's bad enough, you should still put some resources into preventing it.
Reduce the negative impacts of climate change, including, amongst other opportunities, encouraging the adoption of policies to mitigate global warming, e.g. by lobbying for a tax on emissions of greenhouse gases, domestically or internationally, investment in research and development and scaling of clean technology, e.g. by developing cheaper solar panels, preparation and adaptation to limit the negative impacts of climate change, e.g. by funding research on drought-resistant crops, research on geoengineering, to determine efficacy and likely side effects of efforts to limit the warming effects of emissions, e.g. by conducting additional climate model tests. See our page on this topic here. We are not confident in our assessments of the likely returns to any of these types activities. We plan to eventually do more research on the returns to past philanthropic engagements with these strategies. Back to top. Who else is working on this? We are not aware of an authoritative source for tracking overall engagement or funding flows in climate change. We have identified several sources that provide estimates of the amount of nonprofit or foundation funding devoted to addressing climate change. According to the Foundation Center, U.S. foundations granted roughly $900 million to climate change issues in 2008, with more than half of the funding coming from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. One based on this source, 2008 appears to have been an outlier because of a one-off transfer from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation to the Climate Works Foundation. Matthew Nisbet, a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., estimated that U.S. environmental groups spent $394 million in 2009 on climate and energy efforts, while the opposing coalition of conservative groups and industry associations spent $259 million in the area, too. A 2012 report by the Environmental Grant Makers
the U.S. environmental groups spent $394 million in 2009 on climate change, while the opposing coalition of conservative groups and industry associations spent $259 million. Oh, yikes.
Association indicated that roughly 21% of all environmental grants made by U.S. foundations in 2009, totaling about $330 million, went towards climate change and energy issues. Point 3. We do not have a good sense of the methodology for any of these reports, and even the most recent ones describe the situation in 2009, so they may already be meaningfully out of date. Based on these reports and an off-the-record conversation, we would estimate the typical annual philanthropic spending on climate change mitigation in the U.S. is likely in the range of a few $100 million. Of course, philanthropic funding, and American philanthropic funding output, makes up only a portion of all of the funding globally devoted to addressing climate change. We have not seen any estimates of global funding levels across sectors, but U.S. federal government reports seem to indicate that they spend roughly $8 billion a year on climate change efforts, mostly $6 billion a year on developing technology to reduce emissions. 4. Across these different funding sources, we don't have much sense of what activities, at a very granular level, the funds have been spent on. Of the 4 very broad strategies of climate change philanthropy that are described above, our impressions are that most philanthropic funding focused on climate change goes towards the strategy of encouraging government adoption of policies to mitigate climate change, with the Climate Works Foundation playing a particular notable role, with around $150 million in spending in 2011. 5. A large portion of U.S. government funding, more than $5 billion a year, and large amounts of private, for-profit, capital are invested in development of lower emissions technology. We don't have a sense of how much philanthropic funding is spent here. 6. Some philanthropic funding goes towards climate change adaptation, but we don't know how much. Geoengineering research receives relatively little funding, from either government or philanthropic sources. 7. Back. To top, questions for further investigation. Our research in this area has been relatively limited, and many important questions remain unanswered by our investigation. Amongst other topics, our further research on this cause might address: have there been significant strides in scientific understanding of the likely impacts of climate change since the last IPCC report in 2007? How much philanthropic funding and effort goes into climate change globally? How reliable are the estimates from U.S. sources? What have the returns to past philanthropic involvement in climate change efforts been? How have they varied by type of activity? Are there particularly low-hanging fruit in any of the areas of activity described above, e.g. adaptation, geoengineering research, that current levels of philanthropic engagement haven't found?
Yeah, so this was published again in 2013. So the last IPCC report. Okay, yeah, so there was the fourth assessment report was in 2017, the fifth one was in 2014, the sixth one was in 2021/22. We should read these at some point. Yeah, they should probably re-look at it. Might not be high priority. Oh, this is really interesting. When looking at the range of possible futures outlined in the report, the bulk of variation in humanitarian terms comes from variation in the level of assumed economic growth and adaptation, rather than variation in the amount of climate change. So we're more uncertain about the impacts climate change will have, how much it will affect economic growth, and how much we'll be able to adapt to it than we are about what the actual climate change effects will be, at least in terms of how, like, if the variables of the equation are like climate change, how climate change affects economic growth, how we'll adapt, then those two play more of a sense in the humanitarian variable. Okay, broadband policy. It's going to be a controversial one for the Australians.
In a nutshell, what is the problem? There are a number of questions about how broadband internet providers should be regulated. U.S. consumers appear to pay more for slower internet access than European consumers, partially because of a lack of regulation. And regulators are currently deciding whether and how to implement network neutrality rules that would prevent providers from discriminating between different types of traffic. What are possible interventions? The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, appears to have the authority to implement regulations to enforce network neutrality and open access to broadband networks. A funder could support a variety of advocacy or research efforts to encourage effective regulations. Who else is working on it? A number of nonprofits and major technology companies are advocating for the FCC to adopt regulations requiring network neutrality, and a smaller set of groups are advocating for regulation to address cost issues. Published May 2014. Table of contents. What is the problem? What are possible interventions? Who else is working on this? Questions for further investigation. Our process. Sources. What is the problem? We decided to look into the topic of broadband policy because of claims that consumers in the U.S. typically pay more for slower access to broadband internet than in other countries. 1. Network neutrality regulations, which prevent providers from discriminating between different types of network traffic, currently being discussed, are important for preserving the openness and vibrancy of the internet. 2. Because broadband is a natural monopoly, it is plausible that a lack of regulation might lead to poor service and high prices. 3. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, does not publish enough data on broadband pricing to estimate a mean price paid by all American consumers, but estimates by the New America Foundation's Open Technology Institute suggest that U.S. broadband subscribers pay roughly $15 a month more than European broadband subscribers, though with significant variability, for under the somewhat heroic assumption that these costs are accurately estimated, 5 reaching cost parity with Europe, which may not be possible, would shift around $15 billion a year from broadband companies to consumers. 6. It is difficult to estimate the deadweight loss from natural monopoly pricing, and we have not seen any estimates of those costs for broadband services in the U.S. The humanitarian importance of network neutrality regulations is also difficult to ascertain, to the extent that an unregulated internet architecture would impair the conditions that made the internet so successful in the first place. The issue could be quite important. However, it is not clear to what extent neutral networks are necessary to maintain the value of the internet or to what extent regulations are required to preserve neutral networks. Network neutrality violations have historically been rare even when they appear to have been legally permissible, which seems to have been for much of the history of the internet. Point 7. Back to top. What are possible interventions? There are a number of policy options available to address both broadband cost issues and network neutrality. Most notably, the FCC could reclassify broadband as a telecommunications service, which would grant it the legal authority to enforce net neutrality rules by regulating internet service providers as common carriers and to enforce open access provisions, which are said to lower broadband costs in other countries. Point 8. The FCC is currently considering reclassification, along with other policy options. 9. Other policy options might include, the FCC could propose some other form of network neutrality regulation. The FCC could force the 19 states that currently limit or ban municipalities from building local networks to lift their restrictions on local infrastructure investment. 10. Municipalities could build open access local broadband networks to compete with private providers. 11. A funder interested in promoting any of these policies might support advocacy or research organizations working in the field. We do not have a sense of which advocacy activities might be most helpful or how cost-effective they might be. Back to top. Who else is working on this? A number of constituencies are advocating in favor of network neutrality regulations. 12. Public interest technology and communications groups, including Free Press, Public Knowledge, the Center for Democracy and Technology, New America Foundation's Open Technology Institute, the Benton Foundation, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. A number of other advocacy groups have signed on to an open letter supporting net neutrality regulations. 13. Community-focused institutions, including the schools, health, and libraries broadband coalition and the American Library Association. Consumer protection groups, including the Consumers Union and the Consumer Federation of America. Groups focused on social justice in the media, such as the National Hispanic Media Coalition and the Media Action Grassroots Network. Foundations, including the Ford Foundation and the Knight Foundation. Former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps, who now serves as Special Advisor to the Media and Democracy Reform Initiative of Common Cause. Though the most frequent mentions of network neutrality in lobbying disclosure reports have been by major telecommunications providers and trade associations that oppose net neutrality, a number of major technology companies, such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Netflix, and Twitter have also lobbied for and support net neutrality regulations. 14. Back to top. Questions for further investigation. Our research in this area has been relatively limited, and many important questions remain unanswered by our investigation. Amongst other topics, further research on this cause might address how likely and how harmful a network neutrality abuse is likely to be in the absence of regulation, what degree of resources are for-profit and non-profit advocates for net neutrality and open access policies, which are designed to increase competition and reduce costs. Devoting to the issue, are there important gaps in the advocacy infrastructure on either issue? What does the landscape for municipal broadband efforts look like? What are the benefits and costs of open access municipal networks?
Okay, cool. So yeah, I think that's basically net neutrality, which maybe in 2016 was more of an issue. I think, yeah, since then, maybe the consensus has gone that it's not as big an issue as we thought, and I definitely don't think it's that neglected. Wait, sorry, alcohol taxation was 2016. This was in 2014, yeah. Okay, so cannabis policy.
In a nutshell, what is the problem? Our impression is that despite the spread of efforts to legalize recreational cannabis use, there is currently relatively little discussion of which legislation models are best for public health. We believe ineffective regulation may carry substantial public health costs. What are possible interventions? A philanthropist could fund research into different legalization models and their effects, or could support increased discussion between advocates of cannabis legalization and public health experts with experience in policy related to intoxicants. Who else is working on it? A number of foundations do some work on cannabis policy, often within the broader area of drug policy. We are not aware of any major funders who are focusing on designing cannabis policy with a view to protecting public health. Published, April 2016. Table of contents. What is the problem? What are possible interventions? Who else is working on this? Questions for further investigation. Our process. Sources. Back to top. What is the problem? Since 2012, 4 U.S. states have legalized recreational use and commercial production of cannabis. One, broadly speaking, we consider it likely that the number of states where recreational cannabis consumption is legal will continue to increase. This view is based on conversations with drug policy experts, 2, increased support for legalization in national polls, 3, and our general impressions of the current political climate in the U.S. As discussed below, we believe that different ways of legalizing cannabis use are likely to have widely varying public health implications. In this investigation, we focused on these potential public health effects. We did not thoroughly...
Interesting. So it seems like they're saying not whether cannabis should or shouldn't be, but I think maybe we're assuming that like it will over time, and then but maybe different models, like how much it's taxed and how it's regulated and stuff, may have large impacts. So it might be easier to affect relative things like those, like what form the legalization takes, rather than pro-anti legalization.
Consider other potential effects of legalization, including, for example, effects on arrests or incarceration. We chose to focus on this aspect because we see the question of how to legalize in a public health-friendly way as receiving significantly less attention than the question of whether or not to legalize. We see the former question as potentially very important if legalization efforts continue to succeed, which we find likely. Back to top. Public health effects of commercial cannabis production. Our understanding is that the public health impacts of cannabis legalization are likely to depend on the specifics of how legalization is carried out. However, our impression is that relatively little is known about how different kinds of regulatory regimes are likely to affect public health. We believe that it could be especially important for early moving states to implement well-designed policy, as we consider it likely that later legalization models will be based on earlier ones, i.e. we expect the form that legalization takes overall to be relatively path-dependent. Another consideration in favor of careful policy design early on is that it may be difficult to change existing policies once states have legalized cannabis, especially if, for example, a commercial marijuana industry were to emerge and become established. 4. An example of how policy design might affect public health is the extent to which cannabis is allowed to be produced commercially. Legalization models that enable cannabis production to be fully commercialized may cause cannabis prices to drop considerably. We have heard estimates that prices under commercialization might be 1/10 or less of current prices. 5. Such a price change seems likely to lead to increased consumption of cannabis. In general terms, we expect increased consumption of intoxicants, like cannabis, to have humanitarian costs both for individuals and for society. In addition, our impression is that cannabis specifically can cause harm in a number of known ways. In this investigation, we focused on cannabis dependence as the main relevant harm. Cannabis dependence is associated with a variety of negative effects, including low energy and motivation, relationship and family problems, financial difficulties, and sleep and memory problems. 6. Back to top. Size of the problem. As part of our investigation, we estimated how much harm could potentially be averted by well-designed legislation. See footnote for more details of the calculation. 7. In summary, we assumed that the main harms of suboptimal legalization would be due to increased cannabis dependence, then used our best guesses of how harmful dependence is, and how much it might increase under full commercialization, to estimate what the difference between well and badly designed legislation might be. About 18 million people in the U.S. use cannabis at least once per month. About 7% of these, or 1.25 million people, meet criteria for what we would consider morally relevant cannabis dependence, although other sources report 12% have met criteria for cannabis dependence in the past year. We use an estimated disability weight for cannabis dependence of 0.05. Note that this is lower than the Global Burden of Disease Study's disability weight for cannabis dependence, which is 0.329. The estimates we've seen suggest that if legalization were accompanied by full commercialization, and therefore much lower prices, cannabis consumption would roughly double. We assumed that a doubling in consumption would correspond to a doubling in dependent users. Combining these figures with a cost of $50,000 per disability-adjusted life year daily, the cost of full commercialization comes out at roughly $3 billion, although we have very limited confidence in this estimate. This is relatively low compared to our rough estimates of the importance of other cause areas within U.S. policy. Back to top. What are possible interventions? We have focused our attention on ways to help cannabis legalization go as well as possible in jurisdictions where it does take place, rather than focusing on affecting the likelihood of legalization itself, which we see as drawing more attention from funders. Different legalization models could vary along many dimensions, including the following. 8. What type of organizations are allowed to provide cannabis? What regulations apply to these organizations? What types of products can be sold? How much will the products cost? A funder in this space might consider supporting research into different legalization models and their effects, e.g. analyzing previous instances of legalization, forecasting the effects of new proposals, or developing new legislative approaches. Increased communication between cannabis legalization advocates and public health experts, e.g. holding meetings to discuss different approaches to legalization. Work of this kind could affect cannabis policy in the short term, e.g. by affecting the language of a specific ballot initiative, or the longer term, e.g. by promoting effective models of regulation which can be adopted more widely in the future, or more generally shifting the discourse around cannabis policy. Back to top. Who else is working on this? We do not have a comprehensive picture of which organizations actively support the careful design of cannabis-related policy, as opposed to supporting drug policy reform or cannabis legalization efforts in general. Our impression is that not many groups focus on this aspect of cannabis reform. The Open Society Foundations, OSF, funds some work on cannabis policy as part of its broader program of domestic drug policy reform, but our understanding is that this is not a focus area for OSF. 9. A number of other funders, including the Drug Policy Alliance, the Reverse Foundation, and the Libre Foundation, fund advocacy around improving drug policy more broadly, but do not focus on cannabis policy specifically as far as we know. 10. Back to top. Questions for further investigation. If we were to do further research here, questions we might aim to address include: how responsive will legalization advocates be to proposed measures to protect public health? What policy designs can best capture the benefits of cannabis legalization while preventing large declines in prices and attendant increases in dependence? How does legalizing cannabis affect alcohol consumption patterns and their associated social costs? Back to top. Our process. We have been interested in this area for several years. We have had many conversations with experts on the topics of criminal.
Okay, so this. Oh, okay, so yeah, sorry. I think I must have just zoned out in this section.
Our understanding is that the public health impacts of cannabis legalization are likely to depend on the specifics of how legalization is carried out. However, our impression is that relatively little is known about how different kinds of regulatory regimes are likely to affect public health. We believe that it could be especially important for early-moving states to implement well-designed policy, as we consider it likely that later legalization models will be based on earlier ones, i.e. we expect the form that legalization takes overall to be relatively path-dependent. Another consideration in favor of careful policy design early on is that it may be difficult to change existing policies once states have legalized cannabis, especially if, for example, a commercial marijuana industry were to emerge and become established. 4. An example of how policy design might affect public health is the extent to which cannabis is allowed to be produced commercially. Legalization models that enable cannabis production to be fully commercialized may cause cannabis prices to drop considerably. We have heard estimates that prices under commercialization might be 1/10 or less of current prices. 5. Such a price change seems likely to lead to increased consumption of cannabis. In general terms, we expect increased consumption of intoxicants, like cannabis, to have humanitarian costs both for individuals and for society. In addition, our impression is that cannabis specifically can cause harm in a number of known ways. In this investigation, we focused on cannabis. Okay, so they think that so it had $4 to but see, the good thing about this is we just tax it. Yeah. Cool. I do also, yeah, I like how they lay out this model.
Okay, cool. So let's do federal tax reform.
Research. In a nutshell, what is the problem? The federal tax system in the U.S. is inefficient, overly complicated, unlikely to be able to cover rising federal expenditures in the long run, and may constrain economic growth. What are possible interventions? Fundamental income tax reforms, including shifting the tax base to consumption or broadening the income tax base by eliminating many tax expenditures, may increase rates of economic growth and help address long-run fiscal issues. Smaller adjustments to federal tax policy may also have substantial benefits. These reforms face several political obstacles, and we do not have a strong sense of how additional funding would be able to create policy change. Who else is working on it? Federal tax reform efforts attract significant attention from many think tanks and foundations, including the Tax Policy Center and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, amongst others. Published, March 2016. Table of contents. What is the problem? What policy changes could be helpful? Prospects for reform. Who already works on this? What could a new funder support? Questions for further investigation. Our process. Sources. Back to top. What is the problem? Federal taxes in the U.S. are widely believed to be inefficient and overly complicated. Even taxpayers with simple tax situations spend considerable time and money filing income tax returns. Other individuals and businesses navigate a complex system of around 200 potentially applicable tax expenditures, e.g., deductions, exemptions, and credits. Point 3. The system of tax expenditures makes federal taxes less progressive, narrows the overall base of taxable income, and reduces federal revenue, which may not.
It's highly inefficient and overcomplicated. Even taxpayers with simple tax situations spend considerable time and money filing income tax returns. Other individuals and businesses navigate a complex system of around 200 potentially applicable tax. That is crazy. The system of tax expenditures makes federal tax laws less progressive, narrows the overall base of taxable income, and reduces federal revenue. Many tax expenditures reduce federal revenue without achieving any policy goal.
Americans don't agree about much these days, but they apparently all agree that the federal tax system is unfair, inefficient, and mind-numbingly complex. Berman 2014, PG 17. Goolsby 2006. Around 2/3 of taxpayers take only the standard deduction and do not itemize. Frequently, all of their income is solely from wages from one employer and interest income from one bank. For almost all of these people, the IRS already receives information about each of their sources of income directly from their employers and banks. The IRS then asks the same people to spend time gathering documents and filling out tax forms, or to spend money paying tax preparers to do it. PG 2. The costs of complying with federal income tax requirements are large, and are particularly unwelcome to many middle-class taxpayers whose tax situations are quite simple. Indeed, the data show that the costs of complying are regressive, lower, as a share of income, for wealthier taxpayers. This paper proposes a program known as the Simple Return, which would make it much easier for the millions of taxpayers with a relatively simple tax status to file their taxes. The Simple Return might apply to as many as 40% of Americans, for whom it could save up to 225 million hours of time and more than $2 billion a year in tax preparation fees. PG 2. Brown and Gale 2012. In formal terms, tax expenditures are revenue losses attributable to provisions of the federal tax laws which allow a special exclusion, exemption, or deduction from gross income, or which allow a special credit, preferential rate of tax, or a deferral of liability. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974, PL 93-344, PG 5. The sheer diversity of tax expenditures should also be noted. Although Table 1 lists the largest items, the Office of Management and Budget, 2012 identifies 173 total tax expenditures, 138 of which affect the individual income tax and 80 of which affect the corporate income tax. Some affect both taxes. Meanwhile, the Joint Committee on Taxation, 2012, lists over 200 tax expenditures, PGS 67. Brown and Gale 2012. The most radical option would be to repeal all tax expenditures. This would raise substantial revenue and increase the progressivity of the tax code, PG 11. The canonical focus for income tax reform is to create a system with a broad base that taxes all sources and uses of income at the same rate so as to generate lower statutory rates. Tax expenditure reform would be essential to achieving these goals. Broadening the base entails restricting the use of exclusions and deductions. Taxing all sources and uses of income at the same effective rate entails restricting the use of preferential rates, credits, and deferrals. In short,
The canonical focus of income tax reform is to create a system with a broad base that taxes all sources and uses of income at the same rate as to generate lower statutory rates. Tax expenditure reform would be essential to achieving these goals.
A consumption tax is a tax on spending as opposed to income. Consumption taxation is theoretical. Lie. Appealing because, unlike the income tax, it does not disincentivize investment and saving. Under an income tax, both invested money and the return on invested money are taxed, meaning that income that is invested is ultimately taxed more heavily than income spent immediately. By taxing money when it is spent, a consumption tax avoids this problem and encourages greater capital growth. Dynamic simulation models suggest that a switch to a consumption tax might increase overall economic output by several percentage points in the long run. Our non-verbatim summary of a conversation with Alan Deviard on March 25, 2014. Most economists believe that taxes on consumption, like the VAT, are growth-friendlier than income taxes because they don't reduce the incentive to save. Berman 2014, pg 20.
A non-famous summary of a conversation with Bill Gates. Oh, amazing.
Generally speaking, fundamental tax reform would involve addressing three aspects: the U.S. tax structure. Base. The base is what the system is trying to tax, typically consumption or income. The U.S. nominally has an income tax, though we are pretty far away from taxing a true measure of income. Deviations. The U.S. income tax currently includes many deductions, exemptions, and exclusions, as do most income taxes globally, although these features can make tax codes more complicated. Combining social programs with the income tax can help cut down on paperwork. There have been proposals to merge, for example, the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, with the income tax. Many new value-added taxes, which are a kind of consumption tax, have few deviations, though the older generation of value-added taxes often had much bigger holes in them. Rate structure. The rate structure determines how progressive or regressive a tax system is. The U.S. income tax system is progressive, which means that marginal tax rates rise with income. Value-added taxes typically have a flat rate, and there have been proposals for other flat-rate national taxes. When people talk about fundamental tax reform, they are typically talking about a combination of shifting from income to consumption taxation, eliminating many deviations, and flattening the rate structure.
Yes, I'm not sure why flattening the rate structure would be good. I see that value-added taxes in general better than income taxes. But yeah, maybe if you had value-added taxes with progressive rebates.
A consumption tax is a tax on spending as opposed to income. Consumption taxation is theoretical. Lie. Appealing because, unlike the income tax, it does not disincentivize investment and saving. Under an income tax, both invested money and the return on invested money are taxed, meaning that income that is invested is ultimately taxed more heavily than income spent immediately. By taxing money when it is spent, a consumption tax avoids this problem and encourages greater capital growth. Dynamic simulation models suggest that a switch to a consumption tax might increase overall economic output by several percentage points in the long run. Several types of consumption tax have been proposed. A value-added tax, VAT, somewhat like a sales tax, uses a flat tax structure. The X tax is a progressive consumption tax that taxes businesses on value-added minus wages and individuals on wages. The personal expenditure tax, PET, is a progressive tax on household expenditures which eliminates business taxes altogether. The X tax and PET are both viable forms of...
Okay, so this is interesting. So the VAT is... The X tax is a progressive consumption tax that taxes businesses on value added minus wages and individuals on wages. The personal expenditure tax is a progressive tax on household expenditures, which eliminates business taxes altogether.
Of progressive consumption taxation, with several benefits. They are simpler than the current system, especially the X tax. They allow capital to be allocated more efficiently. They remove disincentives to saving in order to deepen capital and increase long-term growth. They would attract new foreign investment to the U.S., due to the elimination of corporate income taxes. Additionally, a significant part of the X tax's burden on existing wealth falls on foreign holders of U.S. business equity. Overall, Dr. Veer believes the X tax to be slightly superior to the PET. While some economists argue that a pure consumption tax would be much better than the existing U.S. income tax, Dr. Gale believes that most of the benefits of such a tax come from the shift from the existing income tax to a pure income tax that taxed all income at the same rate with no exclusions or deductions, rather than the further shift from a pure income tax to a pure consumption tax. Shifting from a pure income tax to a pure consumption tax would likely have a relatively small impact on saving and investing, and therefore growth, because a pure consumption tax eventually taxes most of the returns to saving and investing, namely, the compensation for bearing risk and idiosyncratic returns. Although a pure consumption tax does not tax the return to delay in consumption, this return tends to be...
Sorry, I missed that. Personal expenditure tax. Oh, my Googling skills have triumphed. Oh, Heritage Foundation. We're fucked. Under a bit, each household files an annual tax return.
Under OPET, each household files an annual tax return on which it reports income, deducts saving, deposits into savings accounts, asset purchases, amounts lent to others, and payments, both interest and principal, made on outstanding debts, and heads to saving, withdrawals from savings accounts, gross proceeds of asset sales, amounts borrowed from others, and payments, both interest and principal, received on outstanding loans. The resulting measure equals the household's before-tax consumption, which is then taxed at graduated rates. To further increase progressivity, refundable tax credits can be provided to households with low consumption.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, this is a really cool idea. So the idea, the idea that the seems to be gesturing at. Also, what is this website? Yeah, okay, so each household on which it reports income deducts savings and adds to savings. So you report all the income you made, you deduct all the savings you made, which is deposits into saving accounts, asset purchases, amount lent to others, payment, both interest and principal, made on outstanding debts. Interesting about the asset purchases, because like maybe that just means like stocks and, you know, financial assets, but if it means like a house is both a consumable asset and a financial asset, so yeah, hopefully it just means financial. Oh, this is such a good rabbit hole. I love it.
The X-tax is an approach to taxation, suggested in the United States, that can be described as a standard European-style credit invoice value-added tax, VAT, except that wages are deducted by businesses and taxed at progressive rates to workers. 1. Businesses are taxed on gross receipts and individuals taxed on wages, with neither businesses or individuals paying tax on financial transactions or financial instruments. 1. The plan was created by Princeton University, economist and New York University School of Law Professor David F. Bradford. 2. Bradford states the X tax could alleviate the complexities and avoidance issues plaguing the existing U.S. system. 3. And argues that the government should exempt from taxation all dividends, interest, and other income from savings. That way, people will be treated equally by the tax system, whether they choose to spend now or save to increase their future spending power. 2.
Governments should exempt from taxation all dividends, interest, and other income from savings. That way, people will be treated equally by the tax system, whether they choose to spend now or save to increase their future spending power.
PET's lack of a tax on business firms may be an optical problem. The PET also faces an optical challenge with respect to the tax treatment of borrowing. In accord with income tax principles, the current tax system does not tax the proceeds of borrowing. In contrast, a pure form of the PET taxes households on the proceeds of borrowing, but allows the borrower to deduct all subsequent loan payments, both principal and interest, although those deductions offset the initial tax and present discounted value. If the household remains in the same tax bracket, the initial tax on borrowing may still be unpopular. Modifying the PET to remove the tax on borrowing can lead to complexity and unintended results, as Seidman, 1997, 100-104, discussed.
Okay, so my headphones are dying, so I'm gonna take a break there. Ooh, should I? Should I leave the stream on while I'm taking a break? Oh, I wish there was a way of pausing a stream. Yeah, okay, we will end there. Okay, cool. Well, I hope no one watched this. But yeah, it was useful for me. So yeah, awesome.